Welcome to Dreamscribe, your companion on the journey to peaceful sleep. Before you drift off, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps this calming community grow. Where in the world are you tuning in from? Ben Harper was used to silence. The kind that lingers after a long drive on an empty road, the kind that seeps into the spaces between tired thoughts. That's what he had expected when he pulled his newly bought RV into the isolated Black Hollow campground. Instead, the silence here felt wrong, like the forest itself was holding its breath. Ben cut the engine, the soft rumble dying out as he exhaled. The wind didn't move the trees. No crickets hummed in the distance. Just stillness, thick and unnatural, like the world had stopped the moment he parked. He ran a hand through his unshaven stubble, scanning the area. He had expected the campground to be deserted. It was off-season, after all. But the empty fire pits, the abandoned picnic tables, and the rusting swing set swaying in a wind that wasn't there, they all gave him the feeling that someone had left in a hurry. "Not creepy at all," Ben muttered under his breath, reaching for his backpack. The RV door creaked as he pushed it open, a sound that echoed too loudly in the stillness. Inside, the RV was cozy but worn, a relic of the late 90s. Faux wood paneling, a small kitchenette, a narrow bed in the back. The previous owner had left behind a few odd things: a single leather glove, a pack of expired breath mints, and a dusty, antique-looking radio that didn't work. Ben tossed his bag onto the counter and stretched. His back cracked from hours behind the wheel. He clicked on the lights. They flickered before settling into a dim, yellow glow. And that's when he noticed it. The seatbelt on the passenger seat was fastened. Ben frowned. He hadn't touched it. Shrugging it off, he moved to the tiny bedroom in the back. He had barely set foot inside when a soft whisper drifted through the RV. His breath caught in his throat. It was too faint to make out the words, but it was inside with him. Ben's eyes darted around the RV, scanning for the source. Maybe it was the wind, but no, the air outside was dead still. Maybe an old radio transmission, getting caught in the metal frame? Then the whisper came again, this time closer, right behind him. Ben spun around, nothing. Just the kitchenette and the empty chairs. His heart was pounding harder than he wanted to admit. "Okay," he exhaled, forcing a chuckle. "Long drive. I'm hearing things." Still, as he lay down in the narrow bed, a prickling unease settled into his bones. Something felt off. At first, sleep came easily. Exhaustion had a way of pulling him under, drowning out the discomfort of the too-thin mattress. Then, in the deep hours of the night, the whispering started again. Ben's eyes snapped open. It was louder this time. Not from outside. Not from the radio. From inside the walls. His breathing slowed. He lay completely still, ears straining. The whispers weren't just noise anymore. They were words. Low, urgent, unintelligible, but they were speaking to each other. Ben swallowed hard. The voices, they weren't coming from one spot. They were moving, drifting from one wall to the next, circling the RV like a pack of unseen predators. His pulse hammered in his ears as he sat up, sweat clinging to his skin. Every instinct told him to turn on the light, to get up, to leave. But something about the whispering, something deeply unnatural, kept him frozen in place. Then, just as suddenly as they had started, the voices stopped. The silence was so abrupt it felt like a vacuum, as if something had pressed its ear against the walls, listening back. Ben reached for his phone, heart racing. A creak, a deep, dragging sound from the kitchenette, like something shifting inside the walls. His hand shook as he turned on his phone flashlight, scanning the room in a jittering beam of light. Everything looked normal, but he swore he saw the wallpaper bulge, just slightly, like something inside had just moved away from where he was looking. He bolted upright. That was enough. He was leaving. Ben grabbed his keys, his phone, his jacket, but when he reached for the door, it wouldn't open. It wasn't locked. It wasn't jammed. It just wouldn't move, like something on the other side was holding it shut. Ben's breath hitched. He turned back to the room, his mind scrambling for an explanation. That's when he saw it. The seatbelt on the passenger seat was fastened again. Tighter, like something invisible was sitting there. And then, the whispering started again, right behind him. Ben didn't turn around. Every muscle in his body screamed at him to move, to fight, to run, but instinct kept him locked in place. The whispers were right at his back, so close he could feel the breath against his neck. Then one of them, one distinct voice, broke through the others. "Don't turn around." Something exhaled on his skin. Ben lunged for the door, yanking at it with all his strength. The moment he touched the handle, Every whisper in the RV stopped. Everything went deathly still. And then, a single knock came from inside the walls. Ben's breath hitched. Another knock. Slow, deliberate, coming from behind the wallpaper. He stared, unable to breathe. A third knock. Then the wall shifted. Just slightly. Just enough for him to see it. A bulge in the wallpaper. Like a hand pressing from the inside. A hand trying to get out. Ben stumbled backward, crashing into the counter. His shaking hands knocked over the radio, sending it clattering to the floor. And then, the whispering returned. Not a murmur. Not distant. Loud. Urgent. Filling every inch of the RV. They were screaming now. Light bulbs burst overhead. The walls groaned, shifting inward. Ben grabbed his phone, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He turned on the flashlight. For one brief second, before the battery died, he saw shadows moving inside the walls. Faces. Watching him. And then, in the darkness, a single voice whispered, "Ben." The RV knew his name. Ben didn't believe in ghosts. He wasn't superstitious. Didn't get spooked by creaky floorboards or wind-whipped branches against the window. He was a realist, a guy who took the world as it was. No monsters, no curses, just reality. That's why, even though the RV door had been strangely hard to open the night before, and even though he'd heard something that sounded suspiciously like whispers, he told himself it was nothing. Old vehicles make noise, he muttered as he cracked open a lukewarm beer from the RV fridge. The first morning at Black Hollow Campground was ordinary. The sky was a dull gray, clouds thick and unmoving. The forest surrounding the lot felt oddly static, the trees swaying just a little too slowly in the breeze. But otherwise, it was fine. Ben had parked his newly bought RV in the farthest section of the campground, away from the few other trailers parked closer to the front. He liked privacy. This was supposed to be a short stop, a place to rest before continuing west. He wasn't planning on staying long, but something about the emptiness of the campground made him feel like he was already overstaying his welcome. By midday, Ben had gone through his usual road trip routine. Checked the engine, it was fine. Went for a short hike, nothing but quiet, empty trails. Tried to use his phone, no signal. Made lunch, canned soup and a gas burner, classic. He sat outside in a fold-out chair, eating in the stillness, eyes scanning the other RVs in the lot. None of them looked lived in. No cooking smells. No music playing. No campfire smoke curling into the air. Just abandoned vehicles sitting like empty shells. He tried not to think about it. Around 3 p.m., Ben was inside the RV, scrolling through old downloaded podcasts, trying to find something to drown out the silence. Then, from behind him, a faint creak. He froze. It had come from the RV's kitchenette area, near the small cabinets above the sink. Ben turned, brows furrowed. Maybe the RV was settling? Maybe a gust of wind had shifted something? But then, another creak. Slower. Longer. He set his phone down and stood. Opened the cabinet. Nothing inside but a few chipped mugs. Still, an unsettling weight pressed against his chest. That creeping, irrational feeling of being watched. Ben shook it off. He was being paranoid. It was just an old vehicle making old vehicle noises. He grabbed another beer, sat back down, and forced himself to relax. But for the rest of the afternoon, that feeling never quite left. By the time the sun dipped behind the tree line, the temperature dropped. The RV's tiny heater kicked on, filling the space with a low mechanical hum. Ben cooked a quick meal, just something simple. Ramen, a granola bar. Then he sat at the tiny built-in table, sipping a beer, flipping through an old book he'd meant to read for years but never did. Outside, the campground was swallowed in pitch-black darkness. There were no streetlights out here, no distant glow of a city, no movement beyond the occasional gust of wind. He checked his phone screen, still no signal. Fine. Whatever. He'd leave in the morning. He went through his nightly routine, brushed his teeth, locked the RV door, closed all the curtains, made sure the gas was off. Then, just before lying down, a faint rustling sound from outside. Ben froze, hand still on the curtain he had just pulled shut. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It sounded like footsteps. Slow, cautious, moving around the RV. Ben's heartbeat quickened. He strained his ears, waiting. Nothing. Just stillness. Shaking his head, he let out a breath. Maybe he was just on edge from being alone out here. He needed to sleep. Still, he double-checked the lock. It was sometime past midnight when it happened. Ben had been in a restless, shallow sleep, tangled in the thin sheets. the hum of the heater filling the space. Then, the whispering started. Ben's eyes snapped open. It was so quiet at first, he almost thought he was dreaming. But no, the sound was real. It was inside the RV. Low, hushed voices. They were right next to him, murmuring against the walls, as if something was inside the very structure of the RV itself. Ben held his breath. He tried to make out the words, but they were too faint, too tangled together to understand. Then, just as quickly as they had started, they stopped. Ben lay there rigid, ears straining. The RV was silent again. Nothing but the heater's hum. Maybe he had dreamed it. But then, a soft creak from the kitchenette. His stomach dropped. The same cabinet as before. Ben sat up slowly, heart hammering. He reached for his phone, flipped on the flashlight. Something moved. A faint shift in the wallpaper. Ben's breath caught in his throat. He squinted. Did the wall just bulge? Like something was pressing out from inside? For a long moment, he didn't move. Then, taking a shaky breath, he swung his legs out of bed, phone still clenched in his hand. He crept toward the kitchenette, the flashlight beam bouncing off the walls. Everything looked normal, but when he reached for the cabinet handle, a whisper, right at his ear. "Don't open it." Ben whirled around, phone shaking in his grip. The whisper had come from behind him, but there was nothing there. His heart thundered as he took a slow step back. Then, from the front of the RV, the seatbelt clicked into place. Ben's stomach dropped. He didn't fasten it. He hadn't touched it since yesterday. Something was sitting in the passenger seat. And then, a knock. From inside the walls. Ben's blood ran cold. Something was in here with him. And it wasn't alone. A false sense of calm. Ben didn't sleep much after that night. Even when the whispers had stopped, he had lain awake, heart hammering, staring at the ceiling and trying to convince himself that he had imagined it. By morning, sunlight poured through the curtains, chasing away the shadows, and it was easy to pretend that nothing had happened. Easy to rationalize. Maybe the whispers had been the wind slipping through a crack. Maybe the creaking cabinets were just the RV settling. Maybe he dozed off at some point and dreamed it all. But deep down, he knew better. The seatbelt. That wasn't wind. That wasn't the RV settling. That wasn't a dream. Still, stubborn as ever, Ben refused to let his nerves get the best of him. He wasn't going to run away just because of a few creepy noises. So he did what he always did. He tried to push forward. Ben went about his morning as usual. He brushed his teeth in the tiny RV bathroom. He brewed a cup of coffee over the propane burner. He stepped outside for a breath of crisp morning air. But something felt off. It wasn't just the silence of the empty campground. It wasn't just the heavy stillness in the air. It was the subtle, almost imperceptible changes. The RV curtains, he had drawn them closed before bed. Now one was slightly open. His jacket, which he had left on the counter, was now draped over the back of the passenger seat. The fridge door, not quite latched shut. None of it was blatantly wrong. But Ben didn't move any of those things. He swallowed, staring at the slightly ajar curtain. Something had touched them. Someone. Or something. He tried to shake it off. Tried to keep his mind occupied. After breakfast, he took his notebook and started jotting down route options for the next leg of his trip. But then, a sound. Ben froze. A whisper. Right against the RV wall. He turned, pulse pounding, listening. Soft, unintelligible voices. Not from outside. Not from the vents. From the walls themselves. Ben's chest tightened. He slowly got up, moving toward the kitchenette. The whispering grew louder. Then, a thud. Something knocked from inside the wall. Ben staggered back, heart hammering. He stared at the paneling, breath shallow. Another knock. This time closer to the floor. Like something was crawling behind the walls. He swallowed hard. Then, before he could stop himself, he knocked back. Silence. A long, dreadful pause. Then, something knocked twice. Ben's stomach dropped. This wasn't his imagination. Something was in here with him. Ben didn't move for a long moment. His mind raced. What the hell was this? A rat infestation? But no droppings, no signs of nesting. Pipes? No, the RV didn't have any active plumbing running along that section. Wind? It wasn't wind. Then, a slow, deliberate scraping sound. Ben clenched his jaw. It came from just behind the cabinet. A long, drawn-out scratch, like nails dragging against the wood. Ben's hands curled into fists. He grabbed a flashlight, yanked open the cabinet beneath the sink, and aimed the beam inside. Nothing but old cleaning supplies and dust. But the sound, still there, still moving. Ben's breath came out in a shaky exhale. Then, before he could think, the whisper came again, right beside his ear. "Let us out." Ben jerked away, hitting his head on the cabinet frame. He whirled around, flashlight swinging wildly. No one there. The walls were whispering to him. And they weren't alone. Ben was done. Done pretending. Done rationalizing. Done staying in this goddamn RV. He grabbed his keys from the table, muttering to himself. "I'm out. I'm F***king out." He threw open the RV door. Then, he stopped cold. The outside wasn't the same. The campground, the trees, the gravel lot. Gone. Instead, the RV sat in an endless stretch of darkness. No road. No signs. No sky. Just a void. Ben's breath hitched. He turned back inside. The layout of the RV had changed. The kitchenette wasn't where it should be. The door to the bathroom was now on the opposite side. The bed was missing entirely. The RV had shifted, like the walls had moved when he wasn't looking. Ben felt his stomach twist. Then from behind him, footsteps. Not from outside. Not from the roof. From inside. Ben spun around. The passenger seatbelt was buckled again. Only this time. Next story. The headlights of the RV carved twin beams through the dense fog, the high beams barely illuminating the winding, empty road. The night stretched long and lonely, the only sound the steady hum of the tires against the cracked pavement. Sam's hands gripped the steering wheel a little too tight, his knuckles pale in the dim glow of the dashboard. Lisa sat in the passenger seat, her face bathed in the cold light of her phone screen, scrolling absent-mindedly through her messages. They had been driving for hours, and exhaustion was beginning to weigh them down. "We should stop soon," Lisa murmured, stifling a yawn. "I don't think I can keep my eyes open much longer." Sam nodded, his own eyelids heavy. "Yeah, let's find somewhere to park." The GPS flickered uncertainly, struggling to lock onto a signal in the thick forest that lined the road. Then, as if by some unseen force, a symbol popped onto the map, a campsite just a mile ahead. "Looks like we're in luck," Sam muttered, turning the wheel. The RV creaked as they veered onto a gravel path leading into the woods. The trees loomed, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. A wooden sign, old and weathered, barely readable, stood at the entrance, Clover Pines Campground. No signs of other campers. No distant fires flickering in the night. Just them, alone in the swallowing dark. They pulled into an empty clearing, the vast silence of the place pressing down on them. Lisa stepped out first, stretching her arms with a relieved sigh, while Sam shut off the engine. The air was thick with dampness, the scent of rain-soaked earth lingering in the night. As Sam locked the doors and checked the windows, something landed on his shoulder. Drip. He swatted at it instinctively, expecting rain. But his fingers came away smeared with something dark, thick, and oddly warm. His stomach twisted as he rubbed his fingers together, feeling the strange texture. "What the hell?" he muttered. Lisa glanced over. "What?" He lifted his hand for her to see, the black smear catching the dim light. Lisa frowned. "Oil." Sam glanced up. There was a faint, dark stain on the RV ceiling, barely visible in the glow from the interior lights. He shook his head. "Weird. Maybe some kind of leak." Lisa shrugged. "Let's just get some sleep. You can check it in the morning." The first few hours were peaceful. The low hum of crickets outside mixed with the gentle rustling of leaves. Sam lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, exhaustion tugging at him. Lisa had fallen asleep quickly, curled up beneath a blanket, her breathing steady. Then it started. Drip. Sam's eyes fluttered open. Drip. A soft plop, barely audible over Lisa's rhythmic breaths. Drip. He sat up slowly, heart pounding. His eyes darted to the stain above. It had grown. What the hell? Drip. This time he saw it. A thick, black droplet forming along the edge of the stain, swelling, stretching, before it finally detached, falling. Sam flinched. He watched as the droplet landed with a wet splatter near his feet. His breath caught as the black liquid spread, not outward, but inward. The floor seemed to absorb it. Goosebumps prickled his skin. He swallowed hard, willing himself to stay calm. Drip. He turned to Lisa, whispering, Hey, wake up." She stirred, groggy, her voice thick with sleep. "What?" "Look at this," Sam said, pointing at the stain. "I think something's leaking through the ceiling." Lisa squinted up, her brows knitting together. The stain was definitely bigger than before. Too big for just a normal leak. Lisa swung her legs over the bed, sighing. "Maybe the roof is damaged?" Sam exhaled sharply. "I don't think it's water. Lisa frowned at the growing stain. What do you mean? Instead of answering, Sam grabbed a napkin from the small table and reached up cautiously. He dabbed at the stain, expecting to soak up moisture. Instead, the napkin stuck. What the? He pulled. The napkin did not come off. It clung to the ceiling as if fused to it. He gave a harder tug, and the paper finally tore away, but it wasn't dry anymore. It was soaked in black, thick sludge, the edges curling as if burned. Sam felt his pulse quicken. Lisa covered her mouth, stepping back. Then the whispering started. Soft, just on the edge of hearing. A murmuring breath, a distant hush, something wet and hungry. Did you hear that? Sam whispered. Lisa's wide eyes met his. She nodded slowly. Drip. Another thick drop fell, this time onto Lisa's bare shoulder. She let out a strangled gasp, swiping at it. The blackness smeared across her skin like ink. It was warm. Too warm. Then it moved. Lisa screamed. Sam leaped out of bed, grabbing a towel and frantically wiping at Lisa's shoulder. The black smear resisted, stretching as if alive, as if clinging to her. Get it off! Get it off! Lisa's voice was panicked now, raw with fear. Finally, after a few desperate scrubs, the blackness faded, seeping into the towel as if retreating. Lisa clutched her shoulder, eyes darting wildly to the ceiling. What the hell is that? Sam was already on his feet, grabbing the flashlight. He aimed it up at the stain. It was wider. It had spread beyond the ceiling, now creeping down the wall like veins. Sam, Lisa whispered, voice trembling. We need to leave. Sam didn't need to be told twice. He lunged for the RV keys, fumbling as his hands shook. Lisa grabbed their bags, slinging them over her shoulder, her breath coming fast and shallow. Drip. The stain expanded. The whispering grew louder. Drip. 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 Now the sound wasn't just falling liquid. It was footsteps. From the ceiling. Sam twisted the key in the ignition. The RV wouldn't start. Lisa yanked at the door handle. Locked. Then, the whispering turned into a single, wet, drawn-out word. Stay. Lisa screamed. Sam's stomach dropped. They weren't alone. They never had been. The RV rumbled gently along the lonely stretch of highway, its tires humming against the cracked asphalt. Ben and Lisa Carter had been on the road for weeks, tracing a meandering route across the country in their refurbished 1978 Dodge Commander, an old but reliable vehicle that had become their home. The sun had already begun its descent, the sky bruising into shades of violet and orange, and as the long road stretched ahead, Lisa leaned back in the passenger seat, watching the blur of trees and distant hills roll by. You think we should stop soon? She murmured, stretching. Ben, hands firm on the wheel, nodded. Yeah, just need to find a decent spot. We're running low on gas anyway. That was the agreement, the whole point of this trip. They weren't just traveling. They were escaping. The past few months had been a storm of stress, bills, and sleepless nights, and the open road had become their refuge. Lisa had quit her job, and Ben had sold most of their stuff. The idea was simple: explore, live simply, and reconnect. But despite the promise of freedom, there was an unspoken tension between them. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was the creeping doubt about whether they'd made the right decision. Or maybe it was the RV itself. The interior of the Dodge Commander was a patchwork of old and new. Lisa had done most of the decorating: vintage bohemian rugs, LED string lights, and hand-woven blankets draped over the worn leather couch. The walls, lined with wooden panels, made the space feel cozy, at least in the daylight. But at night, something about the RV felt off. Lisa had always been the first to notice it. Little things. A subtle shift in the atmosphere once the sun went down. A faint musty odor that came and went. The way the shadows stretched too far when she turned off the lights. It's an old vehicle, Ben always reasoned. It's bound to creak and settle. Lisa tried to believe that. She really did. Then there was the stain. It had started as a small, dark patch on the ceiling above their bed, barely noticeable at first. Lisa had dismissed it as old water damage, a harmless discoloration from the RV's many years on the road. But over the past week, it had grown. Spread. The stain was inky black, with uneven edges, like an oil spill that refused to dry. Lisa had run her fingers over it once, expecting to feel dampness, but the surface had been dry and smooth, like the rest of the ceiling. Yet, every morning it seemed different. Larger, darker, closer. She had mentioned it to Ben several times. Lisa, that stain is getting bigger. Ben, it's just the old ceiling panels warping. Lisa, I swear it wasn't this close to the bed before. Ben, sighing, "You're overthinking it." She wanted to believe that. She really did. But there was something wrong with that stain. Some nights, when Lisa lay awake, she thought she could see movement in the shadows of their small bedroom. Not the shifting of trees outside or headlights passing by, but something inside. The stain seemed to pulse, like something was watching her. They had settled into a predictable rhythm on the road. 1. Dinner at sunset, a simple meal cooked on their tiny stovetop. 2. A movie or a book, a distraction before bed. 3. Ben would fall asleep fast, his steady breathing filling the space. For Lisa would lie awake, listening. It was during these quiet hours that the sense of unease was at its worst. Some nights, Lisa swore she heard something soft and wet, a dripping sound, but when she looked around, nothing was out of place. The sink was dry. The roof wasn't leaking. And yet, drip, drip, drip. The sound always stopped the second she moved. That evening, they pulled into a remote rest area off the highway. A single parking lot surrounded by towering pine trees, with only one other vehicle parked at the far end. A dim streetlight buzzed overhead, casting a weak yellow glow that barely reached their RV. Lisa looked around uneasily. "Are we sure about this place?" Ben was already shutting off the engine. "It's fine. Just a few hours of sleep, then we're back on the road." Lisa sighed, rubbing her arms against the night's chill. Something about the air felt too still, like the world was holding its breath. They locked up, pulled the curtains shut, and settled in for the night. But Lisa wasn't sure she would sleep at all. Ben, as usual, drifted off within minutes. His slow, steady breaths filled the small space, a comforting reminder that she wasn't alone. Lisa lay beside him, staring at the ceiling. At the stain. It was directly above them now, larger than before. Had it moved again? She pulled the covers up higher, heart thudding in her chest. The air felt wrong. Heavy. Drip. 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 Lisa turned her head sharply toward the sound. The sink? The faucet? No. The stain. Something dark and thick slid down from the ceiling in the dim light. Lisa's breath caught in her throat. It wasn't water. It was black, viscous, alive. And it was reaching for her. Lisa lay frozen beneath the covers, staring at the stain on the ceiling. It had changed again. What was once just a dark blotch had grown, stretched, and now oozed downward, trailing thin, inky tendrils that shimmered in the dim light of the RV. The dripping sound continued, rhythmic and deliberate, like something alive was leaking from the ceiling. Drip, drip, drip. Her breath came shallow and rapid, her heart hammering against her ribs. She nudged Ben urgently. "Ben, wake up!" He groaned, rolling over. "What?" Lisa pointed to the stain, but her hand trembled. "It's moving." Ben blinked blearily, his vision adjusting to the faint glow of the streetlight filtering through the curtains. His gaze followed hers to the ceiling, where the darkness pulsed like something beneath the surface was shifting. For a second, his sleep-addled mind didn't register the unnatural movement. Then, his expression twisted in confusion. "What the hell?" Lisa clutched his arm. "You see it, right? Tell me you see it." Ben sat up, rubbing his face, trying to process what he was seeing. The stain was seeping down the ceiling panel like oil leaking through fabric. It stretched in slow, unnatural motions, as if it was aware of them. A single black droplet detached and fell. Lisa jerked the blanket over her head just as it splashed onto the fabric. The moment it landed, a sharp, chemical stench filled the RV, something burnt, metallic, rotten. "Jesus Christ!" Ben yanked the blanket off and scrambled out of bed. Lisa hesitated, her body rigid with fear, then followed. They stood there in their dimly lit RV, staring at the ceiling, their breaths coming quick and uneven. "It's not water," Lisa whispered. Ben didn't respond. He was too busy watching as the blackness spread further, the stain throbbing like a wound. Then a sound. Not the usual creaks of an aging RV. Not the wind rattling against the frame. It was whispering. Faint, wet, guttural. Like words being formed in thick liquid. Lisa clamped a hand over her mouth as dread curdled in her stomach. The stain bulged, as though something was pressing from the other side. A shape. Something inside the ceiling. Something trying to get through. Ben, breathing hard, grabbed a flashlight from the shelf and shined it directly at the stain. The moment the beam hit the oozing blackness, the whispering stopped. Lisa and Ben stood in silence, the only sound their own shaking breaths. Maybe it was over. Maybe it was some weird trick of the light. Then the light flickered. No, no, no. Ben smacked the flashlight, trying to steady it. And that's when they heard it. Drip, drip, drip. Ben's stomach knotted as he turned the flashlight toward the floor. There, in the dim glow, was a small puddle of black liquid at their feet. Lisa grabbed his wrist, her fingers ice cold. It's dripping from the ceiling. Ben looked up. The stain wasn't above them anymore. It had moved, shifted. The black liquid was now trailing across the ceiling, defying gravity, crawling closer like an insect. It wasn't just a stain. It was alive. Ben lurched backward, dragging Lisa with him. "We need to get the hell out of here." Ben yanked the keys off the counter, fumbling to unlock the door as Lisa grabbed their phones and bag. The RV suddenly felt smaller, the walls pressing in, the air thick with an unnatural heaviness. Lisa's hands shook as she tried to shove her feet into her sneakers. "Hurry up," Ben growled. Lisa turned to grab her jacket when she noticed it. The stain was directly above the door now, and it was dripping faster. The RV lights flickered, then cut out completely, plunging them into absolute darkness. Lisa gasped. "Ben!" Ben's hand found hers, squeezing tight. Somewhere above them, the whispering started again. Low, slurred. The stain had grown. It stretched across the ceiling, tendrils reaching down like grasping hands. Lisa's pulse thundered in her ears. They weren't alone in here. Something was watching. Something was waiting. The RV groaned, a deep, unnatural sound, like the walls were breathing. Then, a single drop of black liquid landed on Lisa's cheek. Cold, thick, alive. She screamed. Ben grabbed Lisa's arm, dragging her toward the back of the RV. They slammed the bedroom door shut, barricading themselves inside. "What the hell is happening?" Lisa sobbed, rubbing at the black liquid on her face, but it wouldn't come off. Ben frantically checked his phone's flashlight. It flickered on. He shined it toward Lisa. Her cheek was fine. No burn marks. No wounds. But the blackness was still there, seeping into her skin. "It's inside me." A voice spoke from the other side of the door. Low. Wet. Hollow. "You've stayed too long." Lisa's blood ran cold. Ben pressed his back against the door, his chest heaving. "Who are you?" he whispered. The voice gurgled. Then a loud slam. The RV shook violently, the walls shuddering like something massive was pressing against them. "Lisa, we have to get out of here." Lisa's breath hitched as she stared at the bedroom ceiling. The stain had followed them, and this time there was a shape inside it. A face. Smiling. Watching. The desperate plan. Lisa's breathing was shallow, her back pressed against the bedroom wall as she clutched her phone like a lifeline. The stain on the ceiling was no longer just a stain. It was shifting, watching, pulsing as though something inside it was breathing. The inky liquid continued to drip, faster now, like it was growing hungry. Drip, drip, drip. Ben's fingers dug into the doorknob, his body tense as he listened to the silence outside the bedroom. The RV had stopped shaking, but the air felt heavier, thick with the acrid scent of something rotten and metallic. Lisa's voice was barely a whisper. "We need to run." Ben swallowed hard. The front door is not an option. Lisa's pulse hammered against her ribs. She knew he was right. The inky tendrils had wrapped around the door, like it was sealing them in. "What about the emergency hatch?" Ben's head snapped toward her. "The one on the roof?" Lisa nodded. "If we can climb out and jump down." Ben was already moving, dragging a chair under the small ceiling hatch. He grabbed the latch and pulled. Nothing. It was stuck. Come on. Ben gritted his teeth and pulled harder. Lisa looked up, her breath catching. The stain had stretched across the ceiling, its inky mass creeping toward the hatch like it knew. "Ben, hurry!" Ben threw his full weight into it. The hatch screeched open. A rush of cold night air spilled into the RV, making the whispering falter, as if the presence inside the stain didn't like the outside. Lisa didn't hesitate. She grabbed Ben's arm and climbed onto the chair, forcing herself up onto the roof. Ben was right behind her. As soon as they pulled themselves out, the RV lurched. A deep, wet groan echoed from inside. Then a slam. The bedroom door had flown open. Ben and Lisa froze, still crouched on the roof. A shadowed figure stood in the doorway below, its head tilted upward, staring at them. It wasn't a person. It was part of the stain. A dripping, black silhouette, humanoid in shape, but faceless, its form pulsing like liquid suspended in air. Lisa couldn't breathe. The figure slowly raised an arm, reaching toward them, and the stain followed. It was coming after them. "Jump," Ben whispered. Lisa's heart pounded. "What?" "Jump." Lisa hesitated. The RV was too high, the ground below covered in gravel and scattered branches. Ben grabbed her hand. We stay up here, we're dead. Lisa nodded, sucking in a sharp breath. On 3. 1. The roof shuddered. 2. The black mass shot upward. 3. They leapt. Lisa hit the ground hard, her knees buckling as pain shot through her leg. Ben rolled on impact, skidding to a stop beside her. The moment they hit the ground, the entire RV groaned, then collapsed inward. The walls buckled, the ceiling caved, the windows shattered, but there was no explosion. Just a sickening, wet sound like meat tearing. Lisa stared in horror as the RV sank into itself, devoured by the spreading blackness. The stain was consuming it. Run! Ben yanked Lisa to her feet. They turned and sprinted toward the tree line, branches whipping against their faces, gravel crunching beneath their feet. Behind them, the RV let out one last guttural groan. And then silence. Lisa and Ben collapsed near a fallen log, gasping for breath, staring back at where their RV had been. It was gone. Nothing remained but an empty, blackened crater. Lisa's chest heaved, her hands trembling as she clutched Ben's arm. What the hell just happened? Ben shook his head, still staring at the black void where the RV once stood. We need to get to the road, he said. Find help. Lisa wiped the sweat from her forehead, forcing herself to stand. Yeah, okay. They moved quickly, weaving through the trees, their footsteps uneven, their bodies still shaking with adrenaline. The woods were too quiet. No wind. No insects. Just a faint drip, drip, drip of something unseen. Ben stopped suddenly. Lisa nearly ran into him. What? She whispered. Ben lifted his flashlight. Ahead, in the darkness, stood their RV. Perfectly intact. Lisa's stomach dropped. No. Ben took a step back, shaking his head. That's impossible. Lisa's fingers dug into her arms, her breathing shallow. We just saw it collapse. We just ran away from it. So why is it here? The porch light flicked on. The engine rumbled to life. Ben grabbed Lisa's wrist. We are not going back in there. The driver's side door swung open. A shadow stepped out. It was Ben. Or at least, it looked like Ben. Same clothes. Same stance. Same face. The only difference. His eyes were completely black. You shouldn't have left, the copy of Ben said. Lisa screamed. Ben yanked her away, and they ran deeper into the woods, not looking back. They ran until their lungs burned, until their legs threatened to collapse beneath them. The trees thinned. Lisa gasped as they burst onto a road. The highway. Ben staggered forward, scanning the darkness for headlights. Lisa choked, staring behind them. There was no RV. No crater. Just empty forest. Ben turned back to the road. Okay, we'll flag someone down. Get out of here. Lisa nodded, pressing her palm against her chest to slow her racing heart. We made it. We actually made it. A pair of headlights appeared in the distance. Lisa sighed in relief, waving her arms. The car slowed, pulling up beside them. The window rolled down. Lisa's stomach plummeted. Sitting in the driver's seat was Lisa. Another Lisa. Her own reflection stared back at her, expression blank, eyes dark. Ben cursed, grabbing Lisa's arm. We are not getting in that car. The other Lisa tilted her head. Why do you run? She asked, voice hollow. Lisa shook her head violently, backing away. This isn't real. None of this is real. The car door opened. The other Lisa stepped out. The trees behind them groaned. Lisa turned and saw it. The black stain was spreading across the road, seeping into the pavement, crawling toward them. The whispering returned. Louder. Closer. Lisa's grip on Ben's hand tightened. There was no escape. The stain had followed them. And this time, it wouldn't let them leave. The road stretched before them, a narrow black ribbon cutting through endless trees. Lisa's breath hitched as she turned back, staring into the darkness of the woods. Nothing. The other Lisa, the thing that wore her face, was gone. The stain had vanished. Even the whispering had stopped. Ben's fingers dug into Lisa's wrist as he pulled her forward. Keep moving. We have to keep moving. Lisa nodded, forcing her legs forward despite the exhaustion clawing at her muscles. A mile. 2 miles. 3. The road was dead silent. No headlights. No distant hum of cars. Lisa swallowed hard. Ben, where are we? Ben didn't answer immediately. Then, in a hoarse whisper, I don't know. Lisa tightened her grip on his arm. Something was wrong. They should have reached another car by now. A town. A gas station. Something. Instead, the road just kept going. And then, Lisa froze. The RV was parked on the side of the road. Lisa's stomach twisted into a cold knot. They had been walking for hours. There was no way they could have circled back. No way. Ben exhaled sharply, shaking his head. No. No, no, no. Lisa stared at the vehicle, pristine and untouched. The windows were dark, empty. The stain was nowhere to be seen. Maybe, Lisa swallowed. Maybe it's not really ours? Ben shook his head, stepping closer. The license plate was the same. The small dent in the fender was still there. It was theirs, but the dripping shadow was gone. Lisa's pulse pounded. What if it's over? Ben turned to her, eyes narrowing. Does it feel over? Lisa didn't answer. Because it didn't. We need to go back, Lisa whispered. Ben's head snapped toward her. Are you insane? Lisa swallowed. We don't know where we are. If the road isn't taking us anywhere, maybe the answer is back there. Ben's jaw tightened. You think we're supposed to go back to the thing that almost killed us? Lisa hesitated, then whispered. I think we never really left. Ben's face paled. He didn't argue. They turned toward the woods and started walking backward. The trees loomed, their skeletal branches reaching like bony fingers. The deeper they went, the heavier the air felt. Lisa didn't know what she expected to find, but when the trees thinned, her breath caught in her throat. The campsite. It was exactly the way they left it. Their folding chairs still circled the unlit fire pit. The lanterns still hung from the tree. Their half-finished drinks sat untouched. And the RV sat where it had always been. Ben's hand tightened around Lisa's. I don't like this. Lisa took a slow step forward. Something wants us here. Ben's voice was barely a whisper. Then maybe we shouldn't be here. Lisa ignored him. She was already walking toward the fire pit. And then she saw it. A notebook. Sitting on one of the chairs. Lisa's fingers trembled as she picked it up. The cover was worn, aged, the pages inside yellowed, like it had been left out in the elements for years. She flipped to the first page, and her blood ran cold. June 5th, 1987. Ben and I arrived at the campsite today. The drive was long, but the weather's perfect. The RV's holding up well. We're finally settling in. Lisa staggered back. The words, her handwriting. But the date, 1987. Lisa's breath came in short gasps as she flipped through the pages. There were more entries. Dozens. All written in her own handwriting. June 6th, 1987. We heard something last night. A soft drip, drip, drip coming from the ceiling. Ben says it's a leak, but I'm not so sure. June 7th, 1987. The stain is growing. And I think it's moving. Lisa's hands trembled. Ben, these are our words. Our experiences. But this is impossible. Ben hovered behind her, his face ashen. Lisa turned to the last page. June 10th, 1987. We tried to run, but the road never ends. The stain is inside us now. There is no escape. Lisa's breath hitched. Ben, and then, the ink on the page moved, shifted, new words formed, right in front of her eyes. June 11th, 1987. You've already done this before. You just don't remember. Lisa dropped the notebook. Her heart was hammering. Ben grabbed her by the shoulders. Lisa, what does it mean? Lisa shook her head violently. It means this isn't the first time. And then, the ink on the page moved, shifted, new words formed, right in front of her eyes. June 11th, 1987. You've already done this before. You just don't remember. Lisa dropped the notebook. Her heart was hammering. Ben grabbed her by the shoulders. Lisa, what does it mean? Lisa shook her head violently. It means this isn't the first time. Lisa's mind spun. How many times had they done this? How many times had they run? How many times had the stain caught them, only for them to start over? Ben backed away, shaking his head. No, I refuse to believe that. Lisa's voice broke. The road wasn't taking us anywhere, Ben. It was just leading us back here. Ben stared at her, horror dawning in his eyes. Lisa turned slowly, and froze. The stain was back. It was above them now, seeping across the treetops, dripping from the branches like thick black rain. Ben's voice was raw. Lisa. Lisa reached for him, but her fingers went through him, like mist, like he wasn't really there, or like they weren't real at all. Lisa looked down at her own hands, translucent. The horror of it all settled deep in her bones. She finally understood. They weren't alive. Not anymore. They were memories, echoes of the past. Just like the notebook, the stain wasn't haunting them. It was keeping them trapped, repeating the same story, over and over and over. The air grew thick. The trees bent inward. The whispering started again. Soft, distant, but growing louder. Lisa turned to Ben, tears in her eyes. We were never going to escape. Ben swallowed hard, his form flickering like a dying light. The stain spread across the sky, the blackness pouring downward, ready to swallow them whole. Lisa took a shaky breath. Maybe it's time we stop running. Ben hesitated, then nodded. Together, they closed their eyes and let the darkness take them. The sky bleeds black. The whispering surrounded them now. Soft, unintelligible voices. They weren't coming from the woods anymore. They were coming from above. Lisa tilted her head back, and her stomach dropped. The sky was bleeding. Thick, black tendrils spilled downward from the treetops, writhing like ink in water. The air reeked of burnt wood, decay, and something metallic, blood. Ben backed away, eyes wild. Lisa, we have to go. Lisa couldn't move. The realization had already sunk its claws into her. There was nowhere to go. They had walked miles, only to end up back at the RV. They had tried running, only to find the road leading them in a loop. They had searched for answers, only to find a notebook that already knew their fate. This was it. This was where they had always ended up. Ben grabbed Lisa's wrist and yanked her forward. We are not dying here. Lisa let herself be pulled. She didn't tell him that they had already died here, because deep down, he already knew. They sprinted toward the RV, lungs burning, legs aching. The whispering grew louder. Lisa dared one last glance at the sky. The blackness was moving. Not like storm clouds. Not like mist. Like something alive. Something watching them. They stumbled up the RV steps. Ben slammed the door behind them and locked it. Lisa pressed her back against the wall, gasping for breath. Ben raked his hands through his hair. We need a plan. We need to. Drip. Lisa's stomach clenched. She turned toward the ceiling. The stain was there, back in its rightful place. But now it was bigger, and it was moving. The inky blackness seeped outward, stretching like fingers across the ceiling. Long-reaching, searching. A single drop slid down. Drip. It hit the floor between Lisa and Ben. And this time, it didn't soak into the carpet. It moved, like something alive. Lisa gasped, scrambling backward. Ben, we need to get out. Ben grabbed her hand. We run on 3. Lisa nodded, throat tight. 1. The stain quivered. 2. The ceiling groaned. The voices screeched. 3. They lunged for the door, and the RV tilted. Ben crashed into the kitchenette. Lisa slammed into the wall, knocking the air from her lungs. The RV was moving, not shaking, not rocking, tilting. Lisa barely had time to scream before the whole vehicle lurched sideways. Dishes shattered. The fridge door flew open. A knife slid from the counter, stabbing into the wall an inch from Lisa's face. The whispering became a roar. And then, the lights flickered. Lisa turned toward the ceiling. The stain was dripping faster now, pooling in the center of the RV. The floor buckled. The walls warped. And then, something crawled out. It was human-shaped, but it wasn't human. A silhouette draped in black ink, faceless, but its head turned toward Lisa with unsettling purpose. It moved wrong, jerkily, like it wasn't fully formed, like it was learning how to exist. Lisa tried to move. Her body wouldn't obey. The thing took a step forward. The ink pooled at its feet, stretching outward like it wanted to pull her in. Ben yanked Lisa's arm. Move. That broke the paralysis. They ran. Lisa threw herself toward the driver's seat, gripping the wheel. Keys. Where were the keys? Ben frantically searched the counter, the seats, the floor, nothing. The ink kept spreading. The whispering grew sharper. Lisa gripped the wheel tighter, tears stinging her eyes. Ben, what do we do? Ben turned, breath heavy, and Lisa saw the answer in his face. They had never escaped before. They weren't going to escape now. Lisa's body trembled. How many times do you think we've done this? Ben didn't answer, because the answer didn't matter. The loop never ended. Not unless they broke it. Lisa looked toward the thing crawling toward them, and she stopped running. Ben's voice broke. Lisa, no. Lisa stepped forward. The thing tilted its head. The ink at its feet pulsed. Lisa exhaled. You want me, don't you? The whispering swelled. Lisa's heartbeat slowed. She understood now. They had been fighting something they were already part of. The stain was them. The memory of them. It wasn't killing them. It was keeping them. Lisa took another step forward. And the thing. It reached out. Ben grabbed her wrist. Lisa turned. Tears ran down his face. His hand was already fading. Transparent. Ben swallowed. If you go, I go. Lisa's voice trembled. Then let's go together. Ben hesitated. Then he nodded. Lisa turned toward the dripping shadow, took one last breath, and stepped into it. For the first time, there was silence. The ink rose, covered them, pulled them under. Lisa felt nothing. Weightless, ageless, gone. And then, everything stopped. Sunlight poured through the trees. The air was crisp, fresh. Birds chirped. The woods were peaceful. A hiker stumbled upon the old campsite. Empty chairs. A fire pit filled with ashes. An abandoned RV. Inside, a notebook lay open on the table. The last entry read, June 12, 1987. We're finally leaving. The hiker frowned, flipping to the next page. But the rest of the book was empty. A gust of wind rattled the door. Somewhere deep in the RV, water dripped. Drip. The hiker shivered. Then slowly closed the notebook and left. Morning broke over the forest. A golden haze bathed the trees in soft light, casting long shadows over the clearing where the old RV sat. It looked normal, ordinary. Just an old camper parked at an abandoned campsite. The only thing out of place. There was no one inside. No sign of Lisa. No sign of Ben. The windows were fogged over, the door slightly ajar. The only sound, a single steady drip. Danny Carter was the kind of man who didn't believe in ghosts. He had hiked these woods 100 times, seen every stretch of road, every forgotten campsite. He wasn't afraid of urban legends, wasn't scared of stories. But when he stumbled into the clearing and saw the RV, something in his gut told him. This was wrong. He wasn't sure why. It looked normal, sure, maybe a little dusty, a little abandoned. But there was something off, like it was waiting. A soft chill ran down his spine. Then he saw it. The door was open. Not much. Just a crack, like it was inviting him in. Danny wasn't the curious type. He didn't go looking for trouble. But something about the RV pulled him forward. His boots crunched against the dirt as he stepped closer. The door creaked as he pushed it open. Inside, the air was stale, heavy, like something had been waiting in the dark for too long. The interior was untouched. A small kitchen, a worn-out couch, a steering wheel facing an endless road to nowhere. And on the table, a notebook. Danny picked it up. The cover was worn leather, soft beneath his fingers. Flipping it open, he skimmed the last page. June 12, 1987. We're finally leaving. Danny frowned. Flipped to the next page. Blank. The whole book, empty. Something about it bothered him, like a story cut off before the last page. Before he could think too much about it, drip. Danny froze. He turned slowly. Looked up. The ceiling stain was there. A dark, wet blotch. Harmless at first glance. But as he stared, it moved. Danny's stomach clenched. The stain stretched, growing, spreading outward like fingers reaching for something unseen. His breath hitched. He wasn't the kind of man who believed in ghosts. But this felt real. Something was wrong with this place. Something was watching him. Then, the whispering started. It was soft at first. Barely there. A hush of unintelligible murmurs, slipping through the RV's walls like voices trapped beneath the floorboards. Danny's hands tightened around the notebook. The voices grew louder. He took a step back, heart hammering. The sound wasn't outside. It was coming from the walls, from the ceiling, from the stain. Danny took another step back, and the door slammed shut. The whispering turned to shrieking. The walls warped. Danny's breath came in ragged gasps. He stumbled backward, knocking over a chair. Drip. A single drop of ink splattered onto the floor between his boots. And this time, it didn't soak in. It moved. Danny watched in horror as the ink stretched, slithered, pooled outward. Like something alive. The stain on the ceiling bulged, trembled. And then, something began to crawl out. Danny didn't stay. Didn't think. Didn't breathe. He ran, slamming into the door, gripping the handle, yanking with all his strength. Locked. The ink spilled down the walls. Something black and shapeless twisted in the corners of the RV, taking form, its head tilting, watching him. Danny screamed. The whispering grew deafening. And then, the stain swallowed the light. The RV fell into darkness. The whispering stopped. The world went silent. Days passed. The RV remained in the clearing. Empty. Silent. Waiting. The door sat slightly open, like it was inviting someone in. Inside, the notebook still sat on the table. A new entry had been added. August 5th, 2024. I should have left the moment I saw it. Below that, a thick blotch of ink, like something had seeped through the pages. In the quiet of the morning, a gentle sound echoed through the RV. A single, steady drip. The stain is a cycle. It doesn't kill. It absorbs. Lisa and Ben were never the first victims. And Danny won't be the last. The RV never leaves. It waits. It calls. It collects. The next passerby will see an abandoned RV, just like Danny did. And when they step inside, the door will close, and the story will begin again. Next story. I've always considered myself a rational person. I've never been one for ghost stories, never bought into the idea that things could be lurking in the shadows, just out of sight, waiting to make themselves known. I guess that's why when I first moved into this old house, I thought it would be the perfect retreat, a quiet, calm space to escape from the chaos of the world. The house was a bit rundown, sure. It had that classic old house charm, creaky floors, antique wooden furniture that had seen better days, and walls that whispered their stories to anyone willing to listen. But it felt safe. There was something comforting about the way the house settled at night, the way the wind would make the windows rattle in their frames. It wasn't unsettling, it was just peaceful, like it was giving me permission to settle in. My first night here, I remember feeling that relief that comes with stepping into a space that's all your own. The place wasn't exactly luxurious, but it was mine. I unpacked a few boxes, got comfortable in the dim lighting that made everything feel a bit more intimate, and let the house absorb me into its quiet embrace. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows in the corners of the rooms, I took a moment to admire the kitchen. It was a small space, but there was something about it that called to me. The cabinets were old, faded with time, but sturdy. I made myself a cup of tea and placed the mug carefully on the counter, noting that the cabinets, although sturdy, creaked a little when I opened them. It wasn't unusual. Old houses tend to have those sounds. Still, the familiarity of it made me feel at ease. A house this old, this worn, it made sense for the cabinets to protest when opened. I locked the kitchen cabinets, a habit I'd developed after a few odd experiences in my old apartment. But nothing serious, just an overactive imagination, I told myself. Nothing more. With everything in place, I settled into bed, thinking about the days ahead and the quiet life I could finally lead. I was just about to fall asleep when it happened. A knock. Not from the front door, which was odd in itself since I hadn't heard anyone approach. No, this was a knock from the kitchen, a soft, rhythmic knock, the kind you might hear if someone were tapping their fingers on wood. It was faint, like the sound of someone testing the air with a gentle tap. My heart skipped a beat, but I dismissed it almost immediately. It was probably the house settling. The wind outside must have shifted just right. I didn't get out of bed to investigate, though. I didn't think I needed to. I was in a new space, getting used to the sounds. I told myself, houses do that, make strange noises. They talk to you if you listen close enough. That's all it was, right? A draft? A loose pipe? Maybe it was just the night, the way the air seemed to press against the walls. I was alone. I should have felt safe, but I didn't. I rolled over and closed my eyes, determined not to let my imagination get the better of me. The knock came again, louder this time, and it seemed to come from one of the cabinets, the one near the far wall of the kitchen. It wasn't the house settling. It was a knock, deliberate, measured, purposeful. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze. The room around me felt still, too still. The walls felt like they were holding their breath with me, like they were waiting for something. My heart pounded, the rhythm of it heavy in my chest. I swallowed hard, trying to make sense of it. Maybe I had imagined it, I thought. Maybe it was a part of the house I hadn't noticed before, something in the plumbing or the pipes. The house was old, after all, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the knock hadn't come from the walls. No, it had come from the cabinet. I wasn't sure what to do. Was I imagining things? Could it have been the wind? But there were no windows open, and I was certain I'd checked every door. I had locked them, hadn't I? I lay still for a while, my body stiff and unrelaxed. The house had settled back into its quiet state, the air heavy with silence. I listened, hoping to hear a noise, something to explain what had just happened, but there was nothing. I wanted to call out, to say something, but the words caught in my throat. I didn't want to sound foolish. I didn't want to believe that something was wrong. I told myself I was being paranoid. It was just a house. I would get used to the noises. Just a house. Nothing more. Right? But as I drifted off to sleep, the feeling of something being off never left me. There was an unease in the pit of my stomach, an odd sensation that I couldn't shake. I couldn't tell if it was the house or something inside me, but I felt like I was being watched. I could almost hear the soft whispers of the walls around me. The next morning, I shook it off, just like I'd shaken off the noise. It wasn't anything, just my imagination. I reminded myself again and again. I had a million things to do, boxes to unpack, furniture to arrange, and I couldn't afford to waste time on silly fears. But that afternoon, when I went to make a cup of coffee, I noticed something strange. The cabinet door near the far wall. It was ajar. Barely, but enough for me to see the empty space inside. I was sure I had closed it the night before. I was certain of it, yet here it was open. My stomach twisted. It could have been me. I could have forgotten, I thought. But deep down, a creeping feeling told me otherwise. There was something unsettling about it, a quiet tension that had taken root in the house, and I didn't know what to make of it. I closed the cabinet with a firm motion, trying to push the unease out of my mind. But the knock from the night before, the sound, so clear in my memory, it echoed in my ears. What if I was wrong? What if it wasn't the house settling? I couldn't bring myself to entertain the thought, but as the sun set and the shadows crept into the corners of the rooms, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. Something had changed, just out of reach, waiting. And then, just as I was about to finish my dinner, I heard it again. A knock. Faint. Quiet. But unmistakable. This time, it came from inside the cabinet. I tried to ignore it, I really did. The knock was faint, barely a sound, but it stayed with me long after it faded into the evening. I told myself it was just the house settling, an old creak of the wooden beams, or the faint rattle of the windows as the wind picked up. But deep down, there was a part of me, something primal, that wouldn't let it go. Something inside me kept whispering that it wasn't the house at all. I thought it was a one-off, that first knock, like a trick of the mind or an odd coincidence. But then it happened again. It was the same time of day, the same quiet moment when the house was still, and I was sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of tea reading. The only sound was the quiet rustling of the leaves outside, the gentle hum of the refrigerator, and the occasional creak of the old wood. The familiar sound of the house settling. But then a sharp knock. It was barely audible at first, like someone gently tapping a nail into the wood, but it came from the same cabinet, the one near the far wall. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze mid-sip, the tea suddenly cold in my hand. I stared at the cabinet, feeling my pulse quicken, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. The knock hadn't been loud, but it had been clear. Clear enough to make me put the cup down slowly, as if the world had shifted just slightly out of place, and I didn't know how to put it back. Maybe I was just hearing things. The wind, the house, maybe even the way my own thoughts bounced around in my head. I had been alone for so long, and this house, well, it was big. Maybe the sound was from something else entirely, something I wasn't aware of. But that didn't explain the strange feeling that gnawed at me. That cold, tight feeling in my chest that I couldn't shake. It was like I was being watched, like something was waiting just behind me, just out of sight, lurking in the shadows of my mind. It wasn't paranoia, at least not at first. But I knew it was building. This sense that the house wasn't just settling, that it wasn't just the wind. The knock, it felt deliberate, and that thought made my stomach turn. I got up from the table, feeling a strange tension in my legs as I walked over to the cabinet. I didn't want to open it. Part of me feared what I might find inside. But I had to. I needed to prove to myself that there was nothing there, that it was just my mind playing tricks. The air in the kitchen was thick now, heavier somehow. It felt like the room was pressing in on me, closing in like I was the only one left in the world. The silence was so absolute that I could hear the faintest creak of the floorboards beneath my feet, the whisper of my breath as I approached the cabinet. My hand trembled as I reached for the knob. The cabinet door was locked. I had checked all the locks when I moved in, but something about this felt different. I looked around the kitchen, my gaze darting to the other cabinets, the fridge, the door leading outside. Everything seemed still. Too still. I unlocked the cabinet door and opened it. Empty. No strange noises. No hidden surprises. It was just an ordinary, empty cabinet. I exhaled, the tension in my chest easing slightly, but not completely. It was just my mind, I thought. There was nothing there. It was all in my head. Right? I slammed the door shut and stepped back, taking another deep breath. I was being ridiculous. I had no reason to feel this way. I was alone. The house was old, yes, but it was safe. I would get used to it. I had to. But then I heard it again. A soft knock. So soft that it could have been mistaken for a distant tap on a piece of wood, but unmistakably there. It was inside the cabinet. I froze. This time, I didn't even move. The knock wasn't loud enough to make the cabinet rattle, but it was clear, and it felt intentional. It was as if something, or someone, was trying to get my attention. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the house settling. This was something else entirely. I stared at the cabinet, the silence in the room almost suffocating now. I felt my pulse thudding in my neck. What was happening? What was this? The thought made my mind spin, 1,000 theories rushing through my head, none of them making any sense. I reached for the door again, almost against my will, and this time, I yanked it open hard, without hesitation. Nothing. Again. Empty. Cold. Silent. I slammed the door shut, so hard this time that the whole cabinet rattled. I stood there, breathing heavily, heart racing, every inch of my body tensed, waiting for something. I don't know what I was waiting for. I didn't want to hear another knock. But I knew deep down, I knew it was coming. The next few days were a blur of trying to convince myself that it was nothing. It was all in my head. I even set up cameras, hoping to catch some sign of what was happening. Maybe I was sleep deprived. Maybe I was hearing things, or maybe the house was just messing with me. The knocking had to be a fluke. But it wasn't. The knocks didn't stop. They came at different times. Sometimes they'd come in the afternoon, during the quiet hours when the light was warm and soft through the windows. Other times, they came in the middle of the night, when the house was at its most silent, its most oppressive. Every knock made my skin crawl, made my blood run cold. The worst part was that it wasn't just the sound anymore. It was everything. There were strange shifts in the air. The room felt colder when the knock came, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something was there with me. The door to the cabinet became a focal point. I couldn't stop looking at it. Each time I passed by, I'd glance at it, just in case something changed. Every creak of it would seem to draw my attention, and every time the knock came, I felt a growing unease. It was getting harder to tell if I was imagining it or if something real was happening. One evening, after I'd spent most of the day trying to distract myself with work, I found myself sitting at the kitchen table again, trying to focus on a book. The house was quiet, almost unnervingly so. I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator, the whisper of the wind against the windows. But then, knock. I froze. This time, the sound came from somewhere else. Not the same cabinet. It came from the cabinets near the back wall. I stared at them, my breath caught in my throat, the hairs on my neck standing up. I didn't dare move. My heart was thundering in my chest, and my skin was prickling with a cold sweat. I didn't want to look, but I had to. It came again. Knock. A soft tap. But this time, I didn't open the cabinet. This time, I just stood there. I wasn't sure what was worse. The knocks, or the way the room seemed to freeze around me, as if the air itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. The silence stretched on, and I found myself clenching my fists, feeling the weight of a decision I didn't know how to make. Do I keep pretending this is nothing? Do I try to ignore it, to convince myself I'm crazy? Or do I finally admit to myself that whatever was knocking inside that cabinet wasn't nothing? I felt trapped, my own mind turning against me. But I couldn't run from it. Not anymore. I couldn't shake the feeling anymore. The knock, every knock, had lodged itself in my thoughts like a splinter. I couldn't escape it. The longer I tried to ignore it, the more persistent it became. And now it was no longer just a sound, a little tap here and there. It was something more, something darker. It wasn't even the knock itself that unnerved me at first. It was the fact that it seemed to be aware of me. It knew I was listening. The pattern had changed, no longer random, no longer just an occasional tapping. Now it came at certain times, like it had a schedule. 1:45 a.m., 3:20 p.m., and always after I had turned off the lights for bed. Every night, the knocking grew louder, more urgent, and yet still so faint that I questioned whether I was hearing it at all. But something deep in my gut told me it was real, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had started setting up cameras, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever was happening. Each morning, I'd rush to check the footage, half expecting to see something, or someone, lurking in the shadows. But every time, there was nothing. Just the quiet, the emptiness of the house. It made me feel like I was going insane. I could see the cabinet standing there in the footage, untouched, silent. Yet, the knock, it always came when the camera was off. It was as if it was purposefully avoiding the lens, taunting me. And it wasn't just the knocking that had changed. Now I noticed things moving on their own. Subtle movements, imperceptible at first. My reflection in the mirror would shift, ever so slightly, when I wasn't looking directly at it. I'd hear whispers in the hallway, so faint that I thought I imagined them, until they became clearer. "Don't open it. It's waiting." The whispers grew louder and more distinct, and I found myself checking over my shoulder more often, listening for any signs of life in the house. I knew I was alone. I knew it, but the paranoia, the feeling of being watched, grew to a level I couldn't dismiss. I couldn't even make myself sleep properly anymore. I started to check the doors, constantly. I'd lock them and double-check the windows, walk from room to room, making sure everything was in place. It didn't help. It only made things worse. Each time I checked, it was like I was trying to convince myself that it was all in my head, but with every step, I felt the house drawing closer, the walls pressing in. One evening, after what felt like the 100th round of checking every door and every lock, I finally gave up. My eyes were heavy with exhaustion, my body worn thin by the lack of sleep. I hadn't even realized I was standing in front of the kitchen cabinet again until I was staring at the door, my breath shallow and ragged. The knock came, right then, sharp and clear. Knock. Knock. It was louder this time, like something was trying to break through. I jerked back, my hand trembling as it hovered over the cabinet. I couldn't do this anymore. I couldn't keep pretending that there was nothing happening. I had to know. I had to see what was behind the door, what was making that sound. I couldn't let it control me. I took a deep breath, and for the first time in days, I opened the cabinet without hesitation. Empty, as always. But that wasn't the problem. The problem was that, even as I closed the door, the knocking didn't stop. It didn't fade away. It was there, coming from the same spot. Knock. 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 I slammed the door shut again, my heart racing, my palms slick with sweat. The knocking didn't stop. I staggered backward, my mind reeling. It was impossible. I had checked. I had seen it with my own eyes. But it was happening again. The sound came from inside the walls now, echoing through the house like something was crawling through the wood. I pressed my hands over my ears, trying to drown it out, but it only grew louder, more persistent. It felt like the knocking was following me, chasing me, waiting for me to break. I needed to stop it. I needed to make it stop. My hands were shaking as I grabbed my phone. I dialed a number, anyone, someone. I needed help. I needed to know I wasn't losing my mind. "Hello," a voice said, groggy but familiar. It was my sister, Sarah. She had always been the calm one, the one who kept things together when I couldn't. Maybe she could make sense of it. Maybe she could help me figure this out. "Sarah," I gasped. "It's happening again. The knocking. It's coming from the cabinet, the walls. It won't stop. You have to come over. Please. Something's wrong. Something's wrong with this house." There was a long silence before she responded. "You need to calm down. What's going on? Just take a deep breath. Where are you right now?" "I'm at the house. The knocking is, Sarah, it's real. I can hear it right now. It won't stop. I'll be there soon, okay? Just stay calm. Lock the doors and stay inside. Don't open the cabinets, don't. Knock. Knock." I froze, hearing it again, clear as day, right as she spoke. The knocking had moved closer. It was in the other room now, in the hallway just behind me, as though it was coming for me. "Sarah, it's here right now. Do you hear it? Do you?" But the line went dead. The phone went silent, and I looked down at it in confusion, panic rising in my chest. The house had grown too quiet again, like it was holding its breath. And then came the footsteps. Soft at first, just a faint shuffle, but then louder, more deliberate. I spun around, half expecting to see someone behind me, but the house was still empty. No one was there. The air had grown colder. The temperature in the room seemed to drop by several degrees, enough that I could see my breath in the dim light. I pulled my cardigan tighter around my shoulders, my teeth chattering as I stood frozen in place. The sound was still there, growing louder. Footsteps, coming from inside the walls, moving closer. I turned toward the hallway. It was dark, so dark I couldn't see anything clearly, but I could hear the footsteps. They were getting closer. I didn't know what to do. Should I hide? Should I run? But the door, the knocking, it was all leading me back to the cabinet. The source of it all. And that's when I saw it. Someone, was standing in the shadows at the end of the hallway. Just out of sight. I couldn't make out its features, but I could feel it watching me, waiting. It was like the house had become its own living thing, and I was its prey. I took a step forward, trying to get a better look, but the figure disappeared as quickly as it had appeared, melting into the darkness. I felt the air shift again, and the house felt even colder, like it was pressing in on me, suffocating me with its silence. The footsteps stopped, the knocking stopped. Everything went still. But something was wrong. Something was terribly wrong. I didn't know if I could take it anymore. I had to get out. I had to leave before whatever was in this house consumed me completely. But just before I could move, before I could make any kind of decision, I heard a voice. Soft, barely a whisper, but it was there. Don't leave. I froze. The voice, it was coming from the cabinet. I could hear it, clear as day, like it was inside my head. My blood ran cold. I tried to step back, but my legs wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, staring at the cabinet as if it were calling to me, pulling me in. I didn't know how much more I could take. I didn't know if I could survive whatever was happening. It was too much. It was too real. But the voice, it called again. You belong here now. I turned and bolted toward the door. I had to leave. But just as I reached the doorframe, the knocking began again. Knock. Knock. Louder this time, almost deafening, as if it were shaking the house apart. It felt like the walls themselves were closing in. And I realized then, with cold clarity, that no matter where I went, no matter how hard I tried to escape, the knocking would follow me. In this section, the MC is losing their grip on reality. The events intensify with supernatural occurrences and psychological horror, increasing the tension and unease. The whispers, footsteps, and voices add layers of terror, pushing the protagonist further into isolation and panic. This section keeps the audience on edge, anticipating what will happen next. Let me know if you'd like to continue with the climax. For Omini, I didn't know how long I'd been standing there, frozen in the hallway, staring at the cabinet. My heart was pounding, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The knocking had stopped. The whispers had faded into silence. But the house wasn't silent. It felt alive. Every creak of the floorboards beneath me, every gust of wind rattling the windows, felt like a reminder of the presence lurking just out of sight. My phone had died. My sister hadn't called back. I was alone, completely alone. I took a step forward, my feet dragging, my body trembling as I approached the cabinet again. The knocking had been louder this time, more urgent. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I couldn't pretend it wasn't happening. I couldn't keep pretending I wasn't hearing things that shouldn't be possible. I reached out for the handle, my fingers trembling so violently I thought I might not be able to grasp it. My chest was tight, my pulse hammering in my ears. I couldn't take it any longer. I needed to face it. Whatever was in there, whatever had been making that sound, I had to see it. I had to end it. Knock. Knock. It came again, this time from inside the cabinet, as if it was echoing through the very walls of the house. I pulled the door open with one sharp motion, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever was causing the noise. The cabinet was empty, as expected. Nothing. Just the darkened shelves, untouched by time or dust. But there was something else. Something more sinister. For a moment, everything was still. I took a step forward, unable to pull my eyes away from the figure at the end of the hall. My feet felt glued to the floor, my body frozen in place. I wanted to scream, to run, but all I could do was stare. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. But I could feel it. It was watching me, waiting. Knock. I flinched, hearing the sound from inside the walls again, but this time it was different. It wasn't in the distance anymore. It was right beside me, right in my ear. I turned toward the kitchen, the sound of it coming from inside the cabinets there. I couldn't escape it. It was everywhere. It was coming from the very air around me. Knock. 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 The figure stepped forward, its movements slow, deliberate. Each step felt like a hammering strike against the floor. It was real. It was alive. And it was coming for me. I ran. I didn't think. I didn't stop. I just ran. The knocking followed me, echoing through the house like a war drum, drowning out everything else. My heart raced in my chest, my breath ragged and shallow. The figure was still behind me, always just out of reach, but I could feel its presence pressing in on me. I turned a corner, my hand sliding along the walls as I stumbled toward the stairs. But the moment my foot touched the first step, the house shifted again. The stairs stretched downward, twisting and curving like a labyrinth. The walls warped around me, the space narrowing as I fell deeper into the shadows. And then I heard it, the voice. You can't leave. It was soft, almost a whisper, but it was unmistakable. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere at once. It didn't feel like it was speaking to me. It felt like it was inside me, rattling through my thoughts like a curse. I turned to look, but I couldn't see anything. The shadows had taken over the room completely now. The knocking was all I could hear. The voice echoed in my ears. You belong here. I ran faster, but the house was changing. It was no longer just a house. It was a maze, a living nightmare. The walls were breathing, the floors groaning beneath my feet, as if the house itself was alive, aware of my every move. And then just as I reached the door to the living room, I heard it again. The knocking, louder than ever, a pounding force that shook the house. Knock, knock, knock. The door flew open, revealing a figure standing in the doorway. A man, or something like a man. His eyes were hollow, empty black pits, and his skin was ashen, stretched tight over bones. His mouth was open wide, too wide, in a grotesque grin that twisted and contorted like something out of a nightmare. And then I understood. It wasn't just the cabinet. It wasn't just the knocking. It was the house itself, the force that had been calling to me, pulling me deeper into its grasp. And the figure was the one who had been knocking. It had always been there, waiting, watching. The house was its prison, and now I was part of it. I could hear my own breathing. Harsh, labored, every breath a struggle as I backed away from the figure in the doorway. My pulse raced, a hammering beat in my ears, drowning out everything else. The sound of my footsteps, the creaks of the house, the faint whispers of the wind. All of it had faded into a distant hum. The only thing that mattered now was the figure in front of me, and the feeling that something was wrong, terribly wrong. I couldn't escape. I knew that now. No matter where I ran, no matter how fast I moved, the house was closing in around me. The walls felt tighter, the air thicker. The more I fought it, the more oppressive the space became. "You can't leave," the voice had whispered earlier, and now, I heard it again, only this time it wasn't coming from the walls. It was inside my head. It was mine. It was my own thoughts, taunting me. "You belong here." I clenched my fists, trying to hold on to what little of myself I had left, but I could feel it slipping. The reality around me was breaking down, becoming more warped and unrecognizable with every second. It was as if the house itself had begun to bleed into my mind, distorting everything I knew. I wasn't sure anymore where the house ended and where I began. I turned away from the figure, its smile so grotesque, so wide and cruel. It felt like it was mocking me, mocking my every move, my every desperate thought. I didn't know what it wanted, or if it even had a purpose beyond feeding on my fear. But one thing was clear, it had one. I stumbled down the hallway, my legs shaking beneath me. My eyes darted around, desperately searching for something, anything, that could give me some sense of control. But there was nothing. The house was silent, almost too silent, like a waiting predator, waiting for me to make the next mistake. I reached the kitchen, the last place I could think of. There had to be something, some way out, some way to make sense of all this madness. But when I turned the corner, when I stepped into the familiar room, I froze. The cabinet. It was back, standing there, just like it had been before. Knock, knock. The sound hit me like a wave, cold and suffocating. I could feel the vibration in my chest, the rhythmic pounding, not just from the cabinet now, but from the very walls around me. The house was alive with it. It was all around me. I wanted to scream, to break free, to tear down the walls and run far away from this nightmare. But I couldn't. My body wouldn't move. I could barely breathe. Knock, knock. The sound was louder now, closer, more urgent. The cabinet door rattled, creaking under the pressure, as if something on the other side was trying to get out. My mind screamed for me to leave, to run, but I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear. I wanted to look away. I wanted to forget about the knocking, forget about the figure, forget about the house that was slowly consuming me. But the sound, the knocking wouldn't let me. And then it stopped. For a moment, everything was silent again. The air hung heavy, like the calm before a storm. I could feel the weight of the stillness pressing down on me, the house waiting, watching. It was as if everything had paused for a breath. And in that silence, something shifted. Something inside me snapped. I turned toward the cabinet. I had to open it. I had to know what was inside. What had been making that sound? What was it trying to tell me? Or was it even real? Was it all just in my head? Maybe the knocking was just a trick, a figment of my imagination, a manifestation of the fear that had taken over. Maybe I was losing my mind. I grabbed the handle. The moment my fingers touched it, a jolt of electricity ran through my body. The air around me seemed to crackle, charged with an energy I couldn't explain. The cabinet door creaked as it slowly began to open. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. But it was hard, so hard. The door swung wide, and there it was. Nothing. Just an empty space, as it had been before. But it felt different now. The emptiness seemed deeper, darker. Like there was something hiding there, something I couldn't see but could feel. It was as if the very air had thickened, filled with a presence that wasn't there before. The knocking came again, but this time, it wasn't just a sound. I felt it. It was as if the knock was inside me, reverberating through my chest, vibrating my bones. The walls, the floor, the ceiling, all of it seemed to shift in time with the rhythm of the knock. It was everywhere, every part of the house, every part of me. And then I heard it. You belong here. It was the voice again. But this time, it wasn't in my head. It was right behind me. I spun around, my heart leaping in my chest, but there was no one there. The room was empty. The house was empty. But the voice that was still there. It was a part of me now, a part of the house, a part of the thing that had been knocking. It had always been there, waiting for me to notice. And now that I had, it wasn't going to let me go. I stumbled back, my legs weak beneath me, my mind spinning in a whirlwind of confusion and terror. The figure was gone. The knocking was gone. The house was still as a grave. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was all just waiting for the next time. Maybe the knocking had never stopped. Maybe it was still happening, just outside my reach, waiting for me to hear it again, waiting for me to come back. I reached for the door, but it wasn't there anymore. I blinked. It was gone. The hallway had disappeared. The house had disappeared. Everything had disappeared. Knock. Knock. It was the knocking. I could hear it again, echoing through the darkness. I wanted to run. I wanted to leave. But I couldn't. I couldn't escape it. It was everywhere. It was inside me now, inside my mind. There was no way out. Knock. 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 It was closer now. So much closer. And then, just as it had before, the knocking stopped. For a brief moment, there was only silence. I could feel my breath catch in my throat. The world felt like it was holding its breath, waiting. But I knew it wasn't over. It would never be over. Because the knocking, it wasn't just from inside the cabinet anymore. It was coming from inside me.